Volume 3, Filipino Folklore.
Hi Oddings, welcome to Stories with Sapphire. I'm your Ate Sapphire. Have you ever experienced sleep paralysis? When your mind is awake but your body is still asleep and you're frozen in place. It can be a truly horrifying ordeal, but it's all just in your head. Or is it? For Ryan and Nate, a real nightmare awaits. And now, it's story time. It was Ryan and Nate's first time camping at Anawangin Cove. With no electricity or cell reception, it was the perfect place to unplug and reconnect with nature after their hectic work week. Ryan had been particularly stressed lately, to the point of having frequent nightmares and episodes of sleep paralysis, and Nate wanted to help him relax. The cove was a pretty busy tourist spot, but luckily, they were able to find a spot that at least felt somewhat isolated. Ryan chopped down some very short trees for firewood just as the sun went down. They built a fire, laid out some blankets, and cracked open some beers. Nate had already reached weekend mode. Ryan was far behind. Ryan, take a deep breath, be in the moment. Worrying about the budget right now isn't going to change anything. Yeah, I know. It's just really hard for me to disconnect. That's why we need to do this more often. The two friends clinked their bottles and cheered to a relaxing weekend. 2 beers turned into 4, which eventually turned into 10. Ryan and Nate were now completely passed out on the forest floor, head to head. Sometime in the middle of the night, Ryan awoke with a gasp. He felt like he was suffocating. He tried to move his arms and legs, but they felt like concrete. Fortunately, this wasn't the first time he'd experienced this. This is just a dream, a stress-induced nightmare. Ryan tried to reassure himself. Just try to wake yourself up. As Ryan lay there, he directed all his focus on moving his head. Just an inch would be enough. But it would not budge. You're not in any real danger. This will all pass. He could hear his breath getting shallower and shallower as the pressure on his chest increased. And that's when he heard it. The breath of someone else. Although he was unable to move his eyes, he shifted his focus downward toward his chest. In his peripheral vision, he could vaguely make out what appeared to be a bald, 300-pound figure sitting on his chest. That had never happened during one of these dreams before. Ryan tried to call out to Nate, but his jaw was frozen shut. The figure now leaned over, coming into Ryan's full view. This isn't real, it's just a nightmare. This isn't Ryan repeated over and over in his head. Just a nightmare. Then he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Finally, Ryan thought, Nate had woken up and was going to help him. But the footsteps walked over to the pile of wood. Ryan heard the clink of metal, and the footsteps walked back to his feet. There was a moment of silence, and then the axe slammed into his ankle. Again and again. The pain felt so unbearably real. But there was nothing Ryan could do but lay there until the nightmare ended. The next morning, Nate awoke, head pounding from his hangover. The fire pit was still roaring. He could have sworn that the fire had died before they passed out. He saw that Ryan was awake as well. So, please tell me you were finally able to disconnect and get some good sleep. Ryan? Nate shook Ryan's shoulder. Ryan's eyes were wide open, but he wasn't moving. Nate stood up in a panic and saw why. With fear-filled eyes, he looked back at the fire. There, in the pit, were Ryan's missing limbs. In the Philippines, there is a large and malevolent spirit called the Bangungot. It lives in the trees, and if you chop down its home, it will seek revenge. It will wait until you've fallen into a deep sleep, usually after a heavy meal or lots of alcohol, and sit on your chest and suffocate you to death. And there's a reason why this story is so popular, because young people, more frequently men of Southeast Asian descent, have been dying of sudden, unexplained nocturnal death syndrome, also referred to as Bangungot, which is also the Tagalog word for nightmare. In the 1950s, the Foundation for Bangungot Research was founded by a man whose son had died of this condition. And while the exact cause of Bangungot is still unknown, doctors speculate that eating a large meal right before bed can possibly trigger it, or an undetected heart spasm can be set off by a nightmare. So maybe our dreams physically affect us more than we'd like to think. Mark just had the worst imaginable trip ever. What was supposed to be the honeymoon of his dreams left him widowered in a foreign country. Sometimes accidents happen. His in-laws offered to let him stay with them in Quezon City, but Mark wanted nothing more than to get back home to Los Angeles. He raced down the narrow roads in his rental car, his mind playing the event over and over in his mind. Was there anything he could have done differently? Why did it have to be her? He was jostled out of his thought loop when the car hit something on the road and swerved. He stopped and got out to inspect. The back driver's side tire was flat, of course. Luckily, he'd done this before and was able to easily swap out the tire for the spare. When he closed the trunk, he saw that someone was now in the car. Hello? Can I help you? Do you need something? He carefully walked to the door. But when he looked in the back seat again, it was empty. Must have been a shadow, he thought to himself. It was late and he was not well. He ran back into the car and hastily drove away. The seatbelt warning flashed. Mark buckled himself in. But the signal continued ringing. His eyes glanced at the rearview mirror. Staring back at him was a woman. Startled, Mark slammed on the brakes. He looked in the rearview mirror again, but this time, his fear subsided. He knew who this woman was. He would have recognized that dress anywhere. It was his wife, Annie. Hi, Langga. I've missed you. I don't understand. How are you here? He began slapping his face, but Annie put her hand on his shoulder. She felt warm. He missed that feeling. I wasn't kidding when I told you about how magical my homeland was. The couple giggled and embraced. That familiar lavender scent engulfed Mark. The radio clicked on and their favorite song began to play. Even if he was just hallucinating, Mark didn't care. He was the happiest he'd been since the accident. We were supposed to spend the rest of our lives together. I don't know how to live without you here. What if I told you there was a way for us to be together again? Yes, dear, absolutely anything. I'll tell you where to go. Are we going to one of those healers you've mentioned before? Is resurrection really possible? And he smiled and nodded. They raced down the long, unlit road as fast as the thoughts raced in Mark's mind. He was happy and confused and worried, but also excited to reunite with his wife. Annie pressed her hand on Mark's knee, forcing him to accelerate. 80, 90, and now over 100 miles per hour. Mark was getting a little nervous. He tried to push Annie's hand away, but she wouldn't budge. It will be quick and painless, and then we'll be together again. Mark now understood what his wife wanted him to do. His survival instincts and his grief were at war in his mind. But intoxicated by the lavenders and the music, Mark decided that he wanted this moment to last forever. He turned to kiss Annie and realized the mistake he made. If only his wife had warned him of the stories she'd heard when she was a child, then he would have known, you never trust a woman in white on Balete Drive. Because of their size, Balete trees are thought to house spirits and supernatural creatures. Balete Drive in the Philippines was named for the trees that used to line it. It's said that if you're driving down that road at night, do not pick up any women dressed in white. Once in your car, you will see her true, hideous form, and she will try to cause a fatal accident so you can suffer like she did. What would you have done if you were in Mark's position? Carmi was the manager of a brand new hotel on Cabuscan, a previously uninhabited island in the Philippines. The idea was to blend the hotel into the natural surroundings so that the wildlife and visitors could coexist peacefully. Because of its remote location, the job required Carmi to live on site, in her own room about 100 feet up a fake tree. Carmi had managed plenty of resorts before, but nothing like this. The owner handed her the keys and told her that there would be odd sounds here and there in the room, but to ignore them. It's just the birds and other critters that can't tell it's not a real tree. As Carmi moved her things in and unpacked, she heard the scratching the owner had mentioned. She cracked open the room's one window to take a peek at the bird pecking at the tree. She smiled. She thought it was a really unique experience to be so integrated with the wildlife. Night fell, and it was about time for bed. Carmi was just about to drift to sleep when the loud scratching awoke her. She covered her ears with her pillow, made a mental note to herself to buy earplugs, and tried to fall back asleep. After a few minutes, she was interrupted again, this time by a slight pounding sound. The charm of living amongst nature had worn off faster than she expected. Carmi pulled up a white noise video on her phone to see if that could drown out the sound. After a few minutes, Carmi was fading back to sleep until she heard a giggle. She paused the video and listened. She looked through her door's peephole. No one there. She looked out her window. Nothing. The sound was coming from the other side of the room, the side that had a 100-foot drop. The scratching began again, then the pounding, scratching, pounding, scratching, pounding, all the while a mysterious disembodied giggle echoed outside. Carmi followed the noise until she pinpointed the spot on the wall where it was all coming from. She placed her ear over the spot and listened. The scratching stopped. And then the bungisnis derives its name from the Cebuano word that means to giggle. It's a giant, one-eyed humanoid monster with tusks protruding from its mouth. It's not a malevolent creature, but it's not very bright and doesn't know its own strength. Unfortunately, Carmi was the victim of its innocent curiosity. It makes me wonder, how often are we harming others without even realizing it? If you don't want nightmares tonight, subscribe to my channel and like and share this video. Submit your own stories to storieswithsapphire@gmail.com. For more spooky, supernatural, and spiritual stories, listen to the Stories with Sapphire podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. If you like what you saw and would like to support this independently run show, head over to patreon.com/storieswithsapphire. Until we meet again, sleep tight.